Thank you very much, Precious. And thank you so much for having us here in Nigeria and in Abuja. You can see that I've already embraced Nigeria. Precious has dressed me very well, and I'm very happy to be wearing your beautiful gear here, and it's nice and cool. We've been really impressed with our stay. I bring you greetings from the University of Kent, from the Tizard Centre, which is a centre for intellectual and developmental disabilities. I've been so impressed with the greeting we've had, the friendliness that we've been shown, and really, I think Abuja is a very beautiful, beautiful city. So my first time in Nigeria has been a very pleasant one. So I'd like to thank you very much for welcoming me, and thank you, Precious, for organising this conference. So I'm going to be talking specifically about intellectual and developmental disabilities. And just to define terms here, intellectual and developmental disability is currently the term that's used globally, though still people like also to use the term learning disability. It's defined in terms of three characteristics: limitations in IQ, an IQ of less than 70, limitations in adaptive behaviour skills. In other words, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD, would have difficulties maybe with getting up in the morning, with having choosing what they're going to wear, or getting dressed, maybe budgeting, and maybe transport. They need help with getting the bus. It's also a lifelong developmental disability, and onset is before the age of 18. So people are not going to get better from intellectual and developmental disabilities. They're going to have that for life, and so they need support. It's normally defined and classified using the international classification systems of the World Health Organization International Classification of Disorders, or ICD-10. Though the American Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5, is also used, and there's slight variations between the two, but basically, generally, an IQ of less than 70 is regarded as the cut-off line for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it's a particular disability that I'm talking about here. So how visible are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD for short? Well, fairly visible, because about 1% of the world's population has an IDD, and that mirrors UK estimates. And this is according to prevalence studies and seminal meta-analyses such as those by Mollick et al. In 2013. IDD also incorporates autistic spectrum disorders, or we like to say autistic spectrum conditions, and that's a neurodevelopmental condition which impacts social functioning, referred to as the triad of impairment. So people would have difficulties with social communication, with social interaction, and social imagination. So maybe having rigidity of thought and rigidity of behaviour. And that's often manifested in stereotypic behaviours, again according to DSM-5. Now, whilst there are very few prevalent studies in Nigeria, we would assume that it will be around the same proportion of the population, around 1%, since prevalence is not specific to particular race, to particular colour, to gender, educational group, or socio-economic background. So people of all different classes and all different socio-economic backgrounds may have a proportion of people with IDD. Now, having said that, Mollick et al.'s cross-cultural analysis of 52 studies across 26 countries found that IDD will tend to be higher in countries with particular challenges, including countries such as India, Pakistan, Egypt, and Nigeria. And actually, location, socio-economic background, and ethnicity, although it doesn't determine whether or not you have an IDD, it may determine your access to treatment and care. So what are some of these challenges then? Well, firstly, health inequalities. pre- and postnatal infections, perinatal brain injury, unsafe delivery practices. Nigeria health services, we know, are generally restricted due to economic pressures, and that's the same in other countries. Socio-economic issues, poverty. The United Nations Millennium Development Goal to end poverty by 2015 clearly didn't happen because we still have poverty across the world. Environmental challenges, poor diet, poor housing, pollution, urban slum or very rural areas. Structural problems, a lack of infrastructure for IDD services. Nigerian academics such as Edouard et al. Has talked about the lack of coordinated efforts by governments in Nigeria. This is not me coming and telling you, this is academics in Nigeria telling me what they're saying. Cultural factors, again, as we heard earlier. If, for example, in some societies the cause of ID is attributed to the gods who are out there to avenge parents' misdemeanours or sent to afflict the parent for no particular offence, or ascribe IDD to supernatural factors, it's little wonder then that the treatment is going to be in a particular way, and maybe the treatment of those people is going to be inappropriate. Now, this is very different to the approaches of other societies where IDD is viewed as a medical situation that can be managed, that people can be helped, but it's viewed as a social construction of a society who actually disable people by their ableist notions of what is normal. So what is normal? Am I normal? Are you normal? What do we define as normal? Maybe normality is actually socially constructed, but we dream up what we think is normal and act accordingly. Others talk about low levels of education of parents and the lack of family-based care. And also, I think, a lack of focus. So until very recently, like many African countries, in Nigeria we can say that IDD as a condition is only just beginning to gain momentum. The focus hitherto has tended to be on other disabilities, like physical disability, rather than intellectual and developmental disability. Child and adolescent populations across the world show the highest prevalence of intellectual and developmental disabilities. But of course that's going to be the case because more cases are going to be found in schools. Whereas in the adult population it's very difficult. Once you've gone past school, are you going to get a diagnosis at all? However, the data is very limited. Different sampling strategies are used in different countries. So for example, household samples versus hospital or administration samples. And also, although ICD-10 and DSM-5 are generally used to classify IDD, different countries will tend to use different psychological assessments or scales or measures which are not normed on the country's own population. So rather than standardised diagnostic systems, so actually sometimes the diagnosis is not quite right, or it's just wrong. And also, Mollick's meta-analysis only looked at 26 countries. Well, we know there's more than 26 countries in the world, so again, our data is limited. Some countries don't actually know their rate at all, they have no idea. So, for example, Venezuela, where IDD isn't actually recorded. And I couldn't find, when I looked at the literature, any real prevalent rates for Nigeria. So, the first thing is to find out exactly who has an intellectual disability. That's very, very difficult. One way that we might be able to find out is by citizen or netizen research using big data sets with online communities. The consequences of this lack of focus on intellectual and developmental disabilities is that people with IDD in Africa are at risk of suffering poor quality of life from lack of care, lack of educational and employment opportunities, and any form of empowerment. They lack an independent voice, and they therefore lack agency. And in this way, we can say that they are invisible, not only to health and social services, but also to the wider society. It's what we say in the UK as a form of social death, that we socially allow people to be invisible. or socially invisible. And even at the end of their lives, palliative care is rarely provided for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And in a study I did with a colleague of mine, David Oliver, we asked hospital staff what they thought about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we found that people were described as being very different. Terminology that was used would be regarded as derogatory, such as imbecile, and that actually there wasn't really any specific care for people with IDD as they were dying. So you can see then what kind of life will people have from childhood to transitions until they die. It's going to be very different, and this is basically discriminatory. So if people are invisible, it's little wonder that they end up in difficult circumstances. Most people are not diagnosed at all. They end up living with their families, and the burden is on their families for them to care for them for most of their lives, if not all of their lives. We know from the limited literature that there is out there that many leave home due to lack of parental support. Some people with mild to moderate learning intellectual disabilities end up begging or scavenging for food on the street to survive. Parents, of course, are the victims here as well, and Olawale and SN, writing about Nigeria, refer to the undisclosing nature of Nigerian families who will not disclose a relative with IDD for fear of shame. And this is coupled sometimes with illiteracy and ignorance of the condition. It can lead to some children with IDD being sent out to beg on the streets by their parents. And this puts these individuals, of course, at risk of bullying, of risk of accidents, sexual assault, and sexually transmitted infections such as HIV. In terms of those who are visible, and we know that in one sense we regard people as invisible because we don't attribute or care for their needs, but in the other sense they can be visible because they may look a little bit different, and they will be behaving differently. They will be subjected to stigma. And this is what Goffman calls the mark of a tainted one, and that stigmatised individuals are devalued. So it's about how we value individuals that are different to us. And in terms of stigma, people with IDD are at risk of being subject to public stigma, where people think that they're dangerous, or as Precious was saying, that they will contaminate us, or also benevolent stigma, that we just pity them. We pity them because they're not like us. In that sense, we are still devaluing them. And of course, if the public are devaluing and stigmatising individuals, what does that do to the self? What does that do to personhood? We find that there are self-fulfilling prophecies, self-stigma, negative belief about self, that the individual can't do anything for themselves. And so they get wrapped in this kind of discourse and this circle of disadvantage. And then courtesy stigma, the stigma by association, that relatives and siblings don't want to be seen with their relative that has IDD for fear that they will be stigmatised themselves. And I'd like to add something else to this whole notion of stigma, and it's what Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice, which includes giving less credibility to a person's testimony or what they say because of how they and the group that they are part of are perceived by others who are very often in more powerful positions. We can use this notion of epistemic injustice to explain how negative stereotypes and prejudice can lead to, for example, a testimony from a key witness of a crime being totally ignored. They have IDD, so we're just going to ignore them. Epistemic injustice also encapsulates the way in which an individual or a group can be prevented from making sense of the wrong that they are suffering, such as stigmatisation or indeed institutional racism. Such a disadvantaged position is due to conceptual resources, such as elaborated language or even speech, itself being unavailable. And these inequalities are also associated again with political position and power. Thus, the vulnerable groups, such as those with IDD, can easily fall into such a non-position within society, often unable to advocate for themselves, and therefore having little chance of gaining any sort of social capital. Now, once we grasp and appreciate how such social injustices are underpinned by epistemic injustice, we can begin to put right the wrong. Now, just in case you think things are difficult in Nigeria, this slide really shows you how difficult things are in the UK at the moment, and actually that we seem to be falling into chaos, both politically and socially, and I would even say, I'd even stretch it to say in some circumstances morally. We started quite well in the UK. Certainly the Community Care Act in 1990 led to the acceleration of the closure of large institutions and long-stay hospitals, and a move from those hospitals to people into the community so that they would be integrated. What came later were social policies such as Valuing People 2001 and Valuing People 2009, which emphasised more independent, supported living models, personalisation and personal budgets for individuals with IDD. We may have physical inclusion of people with disabilities in the UK, but arguably social inclusion has yet to happen. And this is borne out in my own research on social networks and social support. So whereas the general population has an average network size of between 90 and 120 people, excluding social media that is, the average network size of somebody with a mental health difficulty is only 23, and it's only 22 for a person with intellectual developmental disabilities. Now think about that, all the people that you know in your network, that you interact with, that you can gain social support from, and you can be shared out. If you've got a problem, or you need information, or you need a particular type of support, you can go to a range of people. Somebody with intellectual developmental disabilities is very often they've only got one person, that might be their mother. And that's huge demands on that mother. We've also had various scandals in the UK, Winterbourne View and Atlas. These were residential care homes, specialist residential care homes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but actually those people were being routinely abused by staff. So we still have a long way to go in the UK before good quality of care is actually for everyone. So it takes a long time. So where is our baseline and where do we want to go? And while successive governments have failed to stop the erosion of the NHS and social services in the UK, we're clearly in a crisis situation there. But these scandals have forced governments to prioritise the health and social care agenda. The other issue, of course, for the UK is Brexit. What does Brexit mean for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? Well, certainly our government hasn't thought of that. They haven't thought of a lot of things to do with Brexit, but they certainly haven't thought about the potential loss of many thousands of care and support workers, which may mean we'll have to upskill and we'll have to train a whole new sector of UK care workers, because at the moment a lot of our care workers are from across Europe and particularly from the Eastern European countries. And what happens to those people that need help in the interim while we're going through this chaos of Brexit? Well, the issues I have already raised are likely not to be alleviated in the future. And what are the other challenges? Longevity. People in the general population are living longer, and that means that people with IDD are also living longer to ages closer to the general population. This means that we now have parents in their 80s and 90s who are still caring for their adult children, still battling with services, not wanting to make plans for the future very often. And that means that when those parents die, there is a crisis situation for that person with IDD because there's no plan being made. They're put into inappropriate placements, they often end up with unresolved grief, leading to clinical depression, leading to challenging behaviour, leading to being invisible and ignored again. And as people with IDD grow older, they will often have age-related diseases which have an onset earlier than the general population, so cancer, coronary heart disease, dementia. The onset of dementia prevalence rates approaches 100% for people with Down syndrome once they reach the age of 60, and again this can lead to challenging behaviour. Also other challenges technologies such as scientific advancements such as gene therapy and prenatal testing, as well as termination of pregnancy, are being pushed in some countries such as China and such as Iceland as a cost-effective solution to a longer-term overburden on society. This is ethical and moral issues. And this is what Linda Ward calls the new eugenics, claiming that such arguments are based on old prejudices underpinned by the medical model, ignoring more social models of disability and social construction of theory. In Iceland, for example, Down syndrome has virtually been eradicated. Now, is that right? This is very difficult. No parent wishes to have a child with an intellectual and developmental disability, and there needs to be some level of a woman's right to choose, but at the same time, individual decisions do impact on wider societies. And activists argue that the possibilities of future termination devalues people with IDD in the here and now. These are very difficult ethical and moral debates which we need to put into the mix when we're talking about the future for IDD. And then, of course, mass movement of populations, such as, for example, Syria, both in terms of countries which are war-torn. I had a PhD from Syria who told me that any kind of provision for people with IDD had been bombed or was closed due to the threat of bombing. So what happens to those individuals who are moving across countries, who are in refugee camps, and what happens to them in their country of destination? On the other hand, the fact that people with IDD are living longer is to be celebrated, of course. They can now enjoy the whole life cycle, including retirement, as well as transitioning from youth to adulthood. It also means that whatever services we put in and whatever services we develop need to think about the ways to enable individuals to both enjoy retirement, moving from day centres or day provision to other retirement activities, and to think about how to enable people to get jobs, to seek loving relationships. I'm currently working with an NGO in Brazil where we're trying to get people with IDD to be more socially included within the local society there within Brasilia. So it's not easy, it's quite difficult, it means cultural changes, attitudinal changes, but it's very, very exciting. Other future issues and positive notes, the medical to the social model shift in the literature, things like ableism, embodiment, normalcy, and advocacy and self-advocacy are the new paradigms that are coming in. And also legal advancements. So, for example, in the UK, we have the Mental Capacity Act, and this means that there's a presumption that people with IDD are able, on some level, to decide what they want to do with themselves, to decide on everyday matters like what they do, what time they get up, what they want to wear, what they want to eat, rather than being told by people what to do all the time because they have a diagnosis. We also have a Care Act in the UK, which came into force very recently, which was a uniform eligibility criteria for services, so that everybody with IDD will, on some level, get some support. There's also practice changes, and I've just listed a few there in terms of early interventions, applied behaviour analysis, positive behaviour support, active support. What are all these things? They're all ways in which people with IDD can actually be supported to live lives with some quality. I mean, you know, death is the one leveller, isn't it? And in a sense, that's the one thing that we maybe can't predict, but we know is going to definitely happen. And so, in a sense, why shouldn't everybody, including people with IDD, have the same opportunities to a good quality of life while they're on this earth? So things like social prescribing, or helping people to find and develop social relationships so that they're less lonely and isolated, as well as finding out what types of interventions are appropriate, is another area of importance. Now, I'm not suggesting, again, that this is anyway an easy task. And I love David Hockney. He's a guy, a very famous artist from Yorkshire. And this is one of his paintings of the Yorkshire Dales. But for me, this shows the long and winding road. And in the UK, we've had about 50 years of struggling Certainly at the Tizard Centre we've been going for the last 30 years, and we've been banging on to government and social policies, and we've made some changes with their help, with those people in government and social policy who are really understand and get the equality notion. And I feel that we are moving in the right direction, but it's still a long way to go. But I wish you well. I think that the fact that you're even having this conference, and the fact that you've got amazing support, incredible support from everyone, and the fact that this is so well attended is a real testimony to those of you that clearly think that this is an important issue. So I would like to congratulate Precious and congratulate all of you, and thank you for listening to me.